A man is not a land, but he can be a territory of ruin. Elias was such a place, a geography of loss mapped out in sun-cracked leather and silence. His heart was a parcel of fallow ground where nothing had grown for 3 years, not since the fever took his wife and the earth took his child. The ranch, once a thriving testament to his family's grit, had become a monument to his grief. Fences sagged like weary shoulders. The paint on the house peeled back in surrender. And beside the porch, the square of earth that had been his wife's garden was a tangle of thorns and dead stalks, a perfect, aching reflection of the man who owned it. The sky over his acres was a vast, indifferent canvas, most days the color of faded denim, other days the bruised purple of an old sorrow. Silence was the primary crop he cultivated now, a harvest so profound it felt like a physical pressure against the eardrums. It was a silence built from the absence of a woman's laughter and a child's footsteps, a quiet so complete it had its own sound, a low hum of nothingness that had become the soundtrack to his days. He moved through his chores with the grim economy of a man serving a life sentence, his movements stripped of all but necessity. He fed the cattle, patched the same recurring holes in the water trough, and stared at the horizon, waiting for a sunset that promised only another dawn just as empty. He was a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life, a sentry guarding a tomb. He had forgotten the language of hope, the grammar of connection. His world had shrunk to the space between his hands and the work they had to do, a lonely kingdom of dust and duty. Then, one Tuesday, the dust on the horizon thickened into a plume, announcing an invasion. It was Jed, a man whose soul was as barren as Elias's land but without the excuse of tragedy. Jed's truck, a rattling cage of rust and malice, tore up the drive and shuddered to a halt. In the passenger seat was a ghost of a different kind. A woman. Small, still, with eyes that held the deep, polished quiet of ancient stones. Jed hauled her out like a sack of feed. She was Chinese, her face a porcelain mask of dignity that seemed utterly alien in the harsh glare of the Wyoming sun. "Found you a wife, Elias," Jed sneered, the words a spray of gravel. "Payment for that poker debt you can't cover. Figured your house could use a woman's touch. Or something. The cruelty was the point. It was a prank painted in the colors of human trafficking, a joke whose punchline was the desecration of Elias's grief. Jed knew about Elias's wife. Everyone did. To bring another woman here, to call her a wife, was an act of profound violation. Elias's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white, but the anger was a cold, familiar stone in his gut, too heavy to throw. He said nothing. The woman said nothing. She stood between the two men, a point of stillness in a vortex of cruelty and sorrow. Jed shoved a worn carpet bag at her feet, laughed a sound like stones grinding together, and climbed back into his truck. "Don't say I never gave you nothing," he called out, and then he was gone, leaving behind only the settling dust and a silence that was suddenly, terribly, occupied. Elias looked at the woman. Her gaze was level, unblinking. She was not pleading, not crying, not afraid. She was simply there. A fact he had no framework to process. He felt the cold inertia of his grief wash over him. He couldn't help her. He couldn't help himself. He gestured with his chin toward the old shed, the one that used to hold tack before it fell into disuse. "There," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. It was all he could offer. A roof. A shelter from the indifferent sky. He turned his back on her then, on the problem she represented, and walked toward the barn, feeling the weight of her eyes on his retreating figure. He was a territory of ruin, and she was an unwelcome surveyor, standing at his border. The first week was a conversation spoken in the language of slammed doors and averted eyes. Elias rose before dawn, the habit of a lifetime he couldn't shake, and found she was already awake. He would see her silhouette in the dim light, a motionless figure by the shed, watching the sun bleed color into the eastern sky. He left a plate of bread and jerky on a crate near her door, a transaction, not a kindness. It was fuel. He needed her gone, but he was not a man who would let another human starve on his land. It was a conflict of duties, a war between the memory of his own humanity and the crushing weight of his despair. He worked with a frantic, punishing energy, hoping to sweat out the image of her still presence. But she was indelible. a question mark branded onto his landscape. He felt her watching him as he mended the fence line, her gaze a silent weight he could not shrug off. He expected tears, or pleas, or an attempt to run. He received only a profound and unnerving stillness. She did not trespass. She did not speak. She stayed within the small circle of her exile, the shed her lonely embassy. Her silence was different from his. His was a hollow, echoing chamber of loss. Hers felt ancient, deep, and deliberate, a well of quiet that hinted at a strength he could not comprehend. It unnerved him. His solitude had been a fortress, now it felt like a shared prison cell. One afternoon, he saw her from the corner of his eye, sweeping the porch of the main house with a makeshift broom fashioned from a fallen branch. The soft, rhythmic scrape of twig on wood was an intrusion, a sound of domesticity that had been absent for 3 excruciating years. He wanted to yell, to tell her to stop, to leave the dust where it lay, a fitting shroud for a dead house. But the word caught in his throat, choked by a confusion he couldn't name. The porch was his wife's space. It was where she had shelled peas, where she had sung to their son, where her rocking chair had worn smooth, gentle grooves into the floorboards. The woman's careful, methodical sweeping felt like an archaeological dig into his freshest wound. He retreated into the barn, the scent of hay and old leather a familiar comfort, but the sound followed him, a gentle rhythm of restoration that he could not escape. The next day, she washed the windows. With a rag he didn't know she had and a bucket of water from the pump, she scrubbed away years of grime. Light, timid, and pale, entered the front room for the first time since the funeral. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the faded floral pattern on the armchair, the ghost of a life that was. Each small act of labor was a pebble dropped into the stagnant pond of his existence, sending ripples he was not prepared for. He saw her patch a sun-rotted curtain with thread she must have unraveled from the hem of her own dress, her fingers moving with a startling, graceful precision. She was not cleaning. She was mending. And in mending the house, she was trespassing on the sacred ground of his grief, challenging its supremacy with every quiet, determined motion. He watched her, his resentment warring with a flicker of something else, something terrifyingly close to gratitude. He did not know her name. He did not want to know it. To name her would be to acknowledge her, and to acknowledge her would be to let her in. And his heart was a locked room, the key long since buried. Then came the day she walked to the garden. It was a line he had drawn in his mind, a boundary she could not cross. That dead patch of earth was the holiest of holies, the very epicenter of his pain. It was his wife's soul, rendered in soil and stem. He saw her stand at the edge of it, her head bowed as if in prayer, and a raw, protective rage surged in his chest. He took a step forward, a harsh word finally forming on his lips, ready to expel her from this one last, inviolable place. But he stopped. He saw her kneel, not with the arrogance of an intruder, but with the reverence of a pilgrim. She reached out and, with her bare hands, pulled a single, thorny weed from the cracked earth. She laid it gently to the side. Then another. And another. She was not destroying a memorial, she was clearing a grave. He stood there for an unknown measure of time, a statue of conflict, watching her hands, stained with dirt, as she began the slow, patient work of reclamation. He turned and walked away, not in anger, but in a state of profound and unsettling surrender. That evening, he found his favorite work shirt, the one with the tear in the shoulder from a snag on barbed wire, lying folded on the porch rail. The tear was gone. In its place was a seam of such intricate, nearly invisible stitching it looked less like a repair and more like a scar that had healed perfectly. He ran his calloused finger over the threads. It was an act of impossible intimacy. She had touched his garment, poured her skill into it, and returned it to him, whole. He held the shirt to his chest, the scent of clean fabric and sun-dried cotton filling his lungs, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt the stone in his gut shift, just a little. The earth beneath his feet felt infinitesimally less solid. The following week, the dust returned. Jed's truck roared up the drive again, this time with a purpose that felt sharper, more predatory. He swaggered onto the porch, his eyes scanning the clean windows and swept floorboards with a look of smug amusement. Well, "Look at this," he drawled, his voice slick with contempt. "Tidied the place up for you. See? Told you she was useful." Elias stood by the barn door, his body rigid, his hands empty and aching. He was a spectator at his own desecration once more. The woman, whose name he still did not know, came to the door of the shed, her expression unreadable. Jed's eyes fell on her, and his smile widened into a leer. "Time's up, sweetheart. The joke's over. I've got a buyer in Cheyenne who'll pay a prettier price for you than this sad sax poker debt." He took a step toward her, his intent clear. He was here to collect his property. And Elias, caught in the tractor beam of his past, did nothing. He was frozen, a monument to inaction. But the woman was not. She looked not at Jed, but past him, her gaze locking with Elias's across the dusty yard. Her lips, which he had never seen form a word, parted. Her voice, when it came, was not the whisper he might have imagined. It was clear, steady, and resonant, cutting through the oppressive air with the clean authority of a bell. She spoke 2 words, in perfect, unaccented English, a declaration that was also an accusation and a plea. "My husband." The words hung in the air, shattering the silence, shattering the dynamic, shattering everything. Jed stopped dead, his jaw slack with surprise. He looked from her to Elias, a slow, ugly understanding dawning on his face. This was no longer a prank. This was defiance. Elias felt the word strike him like a physical blow. My husband. A title he had not heard in years, a role he had abandoned. She had claimed him, had thrown a shield over herself and, in doing so, had thrown one over him, too. She had named him. She had given him back a part of himself he thought was buried forever. Jed's surprise curdled into rage. "Husband," he spat. "He ain't your husband. He's your keeper. And I'm your owner." He lunged for her, but the spell was broken. The world had shifted on its axis. The woman did not flinch. And Elias, for the first time, moved. He didn't know he was going to until his feet were already carrying him across the yard, closing the distance between himself and the threat. He planted himself between Jed and the woman, a human wall, a sudden and shocking answer to the name she had given him. The silence that followed was entirely new. It was not the silence of grief or the silence of observation. It was the taut, humming silence before a lightning strike. Jed saw the look in Elias's eyes, a look that hadn't been there a moment before, a look that hadn't been there in years, and he took a half step back. It was not fear. Not yet. It was calculation. "This ain't over," Jed snarled, pointing a finger that trembled slightly. "Neither of you seem to understand how this works. I'll be back. And I'll collect what's mine." He stalked back to his truck, the swagger gone, replaced by a stiff-backed fury. He wrenched the door open, threw one last venomous look at the two of them standing together, and then tore out of the drive, leaving them in a cloud of impotent dust. They were alone again, but the space between them had been irrevocably altered. She had built a bridge with 2 words, and he, by taking a single step, had walked across it. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. Her eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They held depths of endurance he could only guess at. He gave a short, sharp nod, an acknowledgement of the treaty she had just signed on their behalf. Then he turned and walked to the dilapidated tool shed. He emerged a moment later with a rusty hoe and a 3-pronged cultivator. He walked over to the edge of her garden plot and set them down on the soil she had so painstakingly cleared. He met her gaze, and for the first time, his voice held something other than the rasp of disuse. It held a sliver of connection. "Leanne," he said, tasting the name in his mouth. He had heard Jed say it, a dismissive utterance. But when Elias spoke it, it sounded like a beginning. Her name was Leanne. And in that moment, in that shared space of defiance, she had made him her husband. The sky began to curdle. Over the next few days, the air grew thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken promise. A new quiet settled over the ranch, but this one was different. It was a silence of alliance, of shared anticipation. Elias worked, but his movements were charged with a new awareness. He was no longer just tending a dying ranch, he was fortifying a perimeter. He found himself watching the horizon not for the end of the day, but for the approach of a threat. Leanne, in turn, worked in her garden with a quiet, ferocious devotion. The first pale green shoots were beginning to push their way through the dark soil, fragile promises of life in a place that had only known death. They were a testament to her faith, a faith that was slowly, imperceptibly, seeping into him. He found himself protecting that small patch of green as if it were the most important thing he owned. When a late frost threatened, he rose in the middle of the night and covered the tender sprouts with old burlap sacks he found in the barn. He did it without a word, and in the morning, she looked from the covered plants to him, and her eyes conveyed a gratitude so profound it needed no sound. They were a team, building something fragile in the shadow of a coming storm. The sky grew darker, the clouds assembling like a bruised and angry army. The wind began to pick up, whispering through the eaves of the house, a mournful prelude to violence. The cattle grew restless in the fields, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The world seemed to be holding its breath. It was on the third day, as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, that the truck appeared again on the horizon. This time, it was not alone. Another truck followed behind it, and Elias could see the silhouettes of 3 other men beside Jed. The time for threats was over. He watched them approach, and he felt not the cold, deadening grip of his old grief, but a hot, clean surge of purpose. He looked at Leanne, who was standing on the porch, her hands gripping the rail, her knuckles white. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but beneath it was the same steely resolve he had seen before, the resolve that had woken him from his slumber. She had named him her husband. Now, he would be. He didn't pick up a weapon. His own 2 hands, hardened by years of labor and loss, would be enough. He walked to the center of the yard and waited, the rain beginning to plaster his shirt to his back, the wind whipping his hair across his face. He was no longer a ghost. He was an anchor, a rock against which the coming tide would break. Jed and his men spilled out of the trucks, their faces grim, their intentions plain. They carried tire irons and heavy lengths of chain. They were not here to reason. They were here to break. Last chance, Elias, Jed shouted over the rising wind. Give her up. This doesn't have to get ugly. Elias didn't answer. He simply held his ground, his eyes locked on Jed. He was a protector. A shield. The words Leanne had spoken echoed in his mind, not as a memory, but as a command. My husband. It was the truest thing in the world. Jed took it as his final answer. He motioned to his men, and they began to advance, fanning out to surround him. They moved with the lazy confidence of predators who believe their prey is already defeated. They were wrong. Elias saw the first man approach from his left, swinging a tire iron in a low, careless arc. Elias moved with a speed that surprised them, that surprised even himself. He sidestepped the blow, grabbed the man's wrist, and used his momentum to spin him off balance, sending him crashing into the man behind him. The fight was a blur of desperate motion, a chaotic ballet set to the music of the roaring wind and the drumming rain. It was not a fight for dominance or for pride. It was a fight for a garden. It was a fight for a mended shirt. It was a fight for the woman on the porch who had looked at his ruin and seen a home. Elias was a cornered animal, fighting with the ferocity of a creature defending its last hope. He took a blow to the ribs that stole his breath, a fist to the jaw that made his vision swim with stars. But for every blow he took, he gave one back, fueled by 3 years of dormant rage and a few weeks of burgeoning hope. He was no longer just Elias, the widower. He was Leanne's husband. And they would not touch her. The climax came when Jed, seeing his men faltering, charged in himself, his face a mask of fury. He swung a heavy chain, aiming for Elias's head. Elias, staggering, ducked under the blow, the chain whistling past his ear, and drove his shoulder hard into Jed's midsection. The 2 men went down in the mud, grappling, rolling, 2 primal forces locked in a desperate struggle. It ended when Elias, his vision clearing for a moment, pinned Jed to the ground, his forearm pressed against his throat. He looked down into the man's terrified, sputtering face, and he saw nothing but pathetic, empty cruelty. There was no more anger left in him. Only a vast, weary finality. "Get off my land," Elias growled, the words torn from his throat. He pushed himself up, leaving Jed gasping in the mud. The other men, seeing their leader defeated, seeing the feral, unbreakable light in Elias's eyes, backed away. They dragged Jed to his feet and bundled him into the truck. The engine sputtered to life, and they retreated, vanquished, leaving only the churned mud and the cleansing rain behind. The storm broke then, in earnest. The heavens opened up, a torrential downpour that washed the blood from his knuckles and the dust from the air. Elias stood alone in the center of the deluge, his chest heaving, his body aching, but his soul, for the first time in an eternity, felt clean. He looked toward the house and saw Leanne standing there, no longer on the porch, but at the threshold of the open front door. She was waiting for him. He had defended his territory. Now, it was time to come home. He stumbled toward the house, each step a testament to the pain racking his body. The world tilted, his strength finally giving out, but before he could fall, she was there. She caught him, her small frame surprisingly strong, and guided him across the threshold, out of the storm and into the quiet warmth of the house. He collapsed into the armchair, the one his wife had favored, the one whose windows Leanne had washed clean. He was vaguely aware of her moving around him, her actions swift and efficient. She returned with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. She knelt before him in the low light of the room, the sound of the rain against the roof a soothing rhythm. She said nothing. No words were necessary now. The battle had said everything that needed to be said. She gently took his bruised and blooded hand in hers, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him. With the same infinite care she had used to tend her garden and mend his shirt, she began to clean his wounds. Her fingers were deft and gentle, tracing the lines of his pain, washing away the dirt and the blood. He watched her, his head leaned back against the chair, his vision blurry with exhaustion. He watched the way her dark hair fell across her face as she concentrated, the set of her jaw, the quiet dignity in her every movement. She had faced down a monster and had not flinched. She had healed his home. Now she was healing him. When she finished with his hands, she moved to the cut on his cheek, dabbing it gently. Her face was close to his, and he could smell the faint scent of rain and damp earth on her skin. It was the scent of life. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, a universe of understanding passed between them. It was an understanding born of shared struggle, of mutual protection. It was the quiet, unshakable language of a found family. He had been a man of ruin, a desolate landscape. She had arrived, a silent gardener, and had planted a seed of defiance in his barren soil. He had watered it with his own blood. And now, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, something new was beginning to grow. He had fought for her. But the truth was, she had been the one to save him. The seasons turned, as they always do, indifferent to the dramas of men but responsive to the care of their hands. The spring that followed the storm was a revelation. The small patch of earth beside the porch, once a graveyard of his wife's memory, exploded into a riot of color and life under Leanne's patient stewardship. Peonies bloomed in audacious bursts of pink, their heavy heads bowing in the breeze. Tall stalks of delphinium reached for the sky, their blue a startling echo of a clearer, more hopeful heaven. It was no longer a place of sorrow. It was a testament to resilience, a living monument not to what was lost, but to what could be reborn. The ranch healed alongside the garden. The fences stood straight and taut, no longer sagging in defeat. A fresh coat of white paint on the house gleamed in the sun, a beacon of renewal. The porch swing, its chains oiled and silent, moved with a gentle, rhythmic grace. Elias and Leanne worked side by side, moving in a comfortable, practiced orbit. The silence between them remained, but it had transformed completely. It was no longer a chasm of grief and misunderstanding, but a shared space of peace, a quiet so full of unspoken understanding that words felt clumsy and intrusive. It was the silence of two people who knew each other's heart without needing to hear it speak. He would watch her in the garden, her hands buried in the rich soil, a small, contented smile on her face, and he would feel a warmth spread through his chest that he had long thought impossible. She would bring him a glass of cool water as he worked on the tractor, her eyes meeting his in a look that spoke of partnership and deep, abiding affection. They had built a life not on the foundations of a shared past, but on the promise of a shared future. They were two broken pieces that had, against all odds, fit together to make something new and whole. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, they sat together on the porch swing, a cup of hot tea steaming in Leanne's hands. They watched the fireflies begin their nightly dance over the blooming garden. He reached out and gently took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple gesture of trust and belonging that spoke volumes. In the quiet of that evening, surrounded by the life they had nurtured together, Elias knew he was no longer a territory of ruin. He was home. And so our story concludes, not with a grand declaration, but with a quiet truth. It ends with a blooming garden and two hands intertwined, a testament to the profound and simple power of human connection. We've witnessed a journey from the depths of despair to the gentle shores of healing, a transformation sparked not by a great event, but by a series of small, courageous acts of care. It's a story that reminds us that a person is not a transaction, not a joke, not an object to be won or discarded. Every soul carries a name and a story, and possesses an inherent dignity that no amount of cruelty can extinguish. It shows us that the deepest wounds, the ones that turn a heart into a barren field, can be healed. Not always by words, but by the quiet persistence of kindness, by the simple act of mending what is torn, cleaning what is tarnished, and nurturing what has the potential for life. This story is a parable about the homes we build. They are not merely structures of wood and nail, but sanctuaries built of mutual respect, of shared labor, of standing as a shield for another against the storms of the world. It is in the act of protecting another that we often find we are saving ourselves. Think, for a moment, about your own life. Who has been the gardener for your soul? Who saw the potential for life in you when all you could see was ruin? Who performed the small, quiet acts of mending that helped put you back together? True strength is not the absence of wounds, it is the courage to help heal the wounds of another. If this story of redemption and the quiet power of kindness resonated with you, please take a moment to show your support. A simple like helps our stories reach others who may need to hear them, and subscribing to the channel ensures you won't miss our future explorations into the heart of the human condition. Thank you for listening.